Sustainable futures don't happen by chance. They're shaped by inclusive leadership, dialogue, and the partnerships across systems. Welcome to Conversations on Sustainable Futures. I am Daniela Bas. Welcome to Conversations on Sustainable Futures. In a world marked by conflict, polarization, mistrust, and rapid technological change, many are asking, is multilateralism still relevant? And today, we look beyond the headlines to explore what the UN can still teach us about leadership, governance, inclusion, and global cooperation. My guest is Dr. John Mathiason, a former United Nations official and professor of international relations and public affairs. Today, we are going to talk about the future of multilateralism, the role of universities, and why inclusive leadership is not only about representation, but about how institutions make decisions, build trust, and serve people. So, John, welcome to my podcast.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to working with you as I did many years ago. We did.
Yes, when I was a junior and you were my boss. And I'm so very proud of have you now on in this conversation with me. Thank you so much. John, let me move away for a moment from the usual language of diplomacy, institutions, and global governance, a world that we both know well. The UN of the 80s and the UN of today, in my view, are no longer playing the same musical score. So if the UN were an orchestra, who is playing the melody now, who is out of tune, and who is still not being heard from your perspective?
Well, the easiest one to say is who is not on playing it correctly. And that, unfortunately, is the government that is the largest collaborator to it, which is the United States of America, which has begun to behave in ways that it never thought it would be doing with the international system that we looked at. Now, playing the music is most of the other governments and a large number of non-governmental organizations who are making the system respond to the problems that it was set up to address. Now, who isn't involved? Well, the interesting thing is who isn't involved very often are the future people, young people, a lot of the people who are affected by problems but don't understand how to deal with the solutions, and somehow they have to be brought on board. And of course, we have to make sure that eventually, even the one who's playing the wrong music comes back and joins the orchestra.
John Mathiason has seen the UN from inside and also outside and studied global governance from the outside. And as I said, a former UN official, professor of international relations and public affairs, and head of a company doing evaluations of international organizations. He has worked across development programs, planning, and results-based management, international institutions, and internet governance. So, John, experience connects the invisible machinery of multilateralism with the bigger question of our time: who decides, who benefits, and how global systems can still serve people. So here, John, I'm going to pop the first question. You have spent years both inside the UN, as I said, and teaching how international institutions work. At the same time, when many people question multilateralism, what does the public often misunderstand about the real role of the UN, and what should leaders, governments, and private companies understand better?
Okay, the interesting thing is that when you look at the United Nations and in terms of what's in public information, you see these big buildings and you see these meetings going on, and sometimes you see peacekeeping troops running around. That's what you see, but that's not what the system is. If you look at how the system has evolved since it was set up in 1945, it has evolved to dealing with something which I would say should be characterized as problems which are cross-border in their nature, that cannot be solved by individual countries or for that matter, companies working by themselves. They have to be solved by everybody. And what has emerged over the last, well, if we look at since I started in the UN, I started in the UN in the mid 1960s. If you look at from then, what you've seen is an evolution of a system to deal with problems. Now, I look at them today in terms of what I call the 5 problems of the apocalypse. These are transborder problems, which if they're not solved, the humans aren't going to do very well on this planet. The first of them is climate change. The next one of those is pandemics, that is, a global health. The third one is nuclear weapons, which is something which actually has been working pretty well, as you and I know, because we worked in Vienna, which is where the International Atomic Energy Agency is. The fourth one is the internet, and in specifically AI, because AI is now coming out as something which is a problem. And the final one is migration, which is a consequence of the other problems. People having to move whether they wanted to or not, because if they don't do well, and migration is an important issue. All of these are being dealt with or have been dealt with, not necessarily successfully, because to do that, you have to have all of the major players on board. And as I say, today, one of the major players, the United States, is not on board. But an increasing number of countries and non-government and people are saying, we got to do something about that. And we'll need an international system that can do that effectively.
Correct. Now, if the UN had to be explained to a 20-year-old using only 3 everyday objects, no flags, no conference rooms, no diplomatic language, or no big buildings, which objects would you choose, John? And what would each one reveal about how the system really works?
Okay, for me, it's fairly simple. There are 3. The first one is a thermometer. The second is a cup of coffee. And the third one is a light bulb. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the thermometer is there because we have a thing in climate change which is reflected in something called global warming. In other words, the temperature is going up, and therefore something has to be done about it. And so one of the things that you want to say is, well, what can we do about what is the nature of the problem and what are we going to do? And there are institutions, international institutions, which are providing a basis for saying that. There have been a basis for agreements. Now, the agreements are not complete. There was what was called the Paris Agreement in 2015, and unfortunately, the United States is now withdrawn from that, but other countries are trying to do it. And a meeting is taking place in Bonn on the World Summit on Climate, preparing for the meeting of the conference on climate where there is a treaty. And that's being done. It's problematic, but it's underway. It's underway. So that's one. And you have to understand how that system works in order to make it work. And of course, it'll only work when all of the players are back on board, including the United States. The second one is a cup of coffee. One of the things that has to be produced for humans to survive is food. Now, I happen to think coffee is very important in the morning because it wakes you up. I've had my coffee and it has woken me up. But in order to produce enough food to meet a growing population, you have to have changes in how people grow food. And one of the things the UN has been good at, particularly in countries that are poor, is to make the technologies change and the trade system emerge that will allow this to happen. And that has been developing over time. It's still running into problems. Again, there are some countries which are putting up tariffs, and there are countries which are cutting back on investment in agriculture for poor people. But it has been working reasonably well at the international system and quietly and unobservably. And I still get good coffee, even though if you're a coffee drinker in a developed country, you have to understand the coffee comes from developing countries.
Yep.
Okay. The third one is the light bulb. And in order to have a light bulb burn and light up your house and things, you have to have energy. And one of the issues is how do we develop energy in a way that will not make things worse in terms of climate change, in terms of food and whatnot. And the answer there is you have to have an investment in technology. And there are some new technologies that are working pretty well, like solar and wind, or old technologies which we've suddenly discovered that we can improve on, and it will work, like nuclear power, which is green.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to reduce our dependence on non-green power. And if we do that, and that's actually happening in a lot of places, because that's a solution, an economic solution to both the problem of how are we going to generate enough electricity and how are we going to avoid climate change. So the system behind things is working, and those are three examples.
John, moving from the UN now to the classroom, since you are also a professor, how do you think today's students would grade the multilateral system, and what would their professors' comment be?
Well, the grading, unfortunately, would be no grading. We don't know how to grade the international system. So we don't give it a B, C, or a D grade. What is it? And the professor was, that's probably our fault because we didn't explain to students early on that the international system was in reality and how it should work in terms of how it addresses problems. And if we did that, something would happen. Now, I have to say, having been a professor, I'm one of the few professors who ever taught a course on management of the international system, because that wasn't something you taught people in public administration. And I taught it, said you have to understand how to manage the system in terms of results, in terms of good planning and whatnot. And I will say this, I once did a study of the people who'd taken my classes, and I found out that a certain proportion of them were working in or with international organizations and understood something called a logical framework, log frame, which is a way of looking at how you make programs work to solve problems. There you are. So if you run the classes, they can affect it, but you've got to get the universities to do these kinds of classes.
Talking about universities, they teach students how international institutions are supposed to work, you just said, but do they also teach enough about how power, ego, bureaucracy, and silence actually work inside institutions, John?
The problem is they don't that much, because they've got a backward view where things are, we resolve, if we say make a deal, the deal is between I win, you lose, or you win and I lose. It's all a zero-sum game. In the real world, it's a non-zero-sum game. You work agreements in order to reach a common agreement that you can both agree with. And that's how the international system works. And you have to then train people to think in terms of how you reach agreements positively and future-oriented and realistic in terms of the resources you have, and a clear understanding of who do you have to engage. And you have to do things like critical thinking, where critical thinking says, I'm going to look at a problem and see how could you solve it, in particularly the problems which are not state-bounded, like that. And you got to teach people to reach agreements without conflict. Consensus is the basis of good agreements, and that should be somehow taught.
You know, a minimum common denominator, it can be reached among people, countries, private companies, multinational groups, whatever, with the different cultural backgrounds, religions, values, laws. And to be able to find that minimum common denominator to work on its magics. And I think that's one of the very important things that multilateralism can offer, at least from my experience. Now, what should future leaders be helped to unlearn before they enter global public service, diplomacy, or international business, from your perspective, John?
Well, they have to unlearn the idea that everything is a profit and a loss, because that's not the case. You have to begin to understand that success is solving problems. Success is not defined in terms of how well I individually do, because you have to have an understanding that success is in some respects collective. And you got to get that out of people's mind. And you have to say you got to plan for the future, not only the present, but the present in terms of the future, taking into account things that are happening, which may not be within your control, but which you will have to deal with in some way by collaboration with someone else. That has to be built in.
You know, there has been a time when I was also in charge of the branch dealing with indigenous issues. And I remember that there are some communities within some tribes and communities of indigenous peoples where the elderly, whenever they take a decision, they think how that decision is going to impact the next 7 generations. Exactly what you were saying right now. It's amazing. Yeah. Now to the second part of our conversation, John. Once upon a time, you were working inside the UN system at a moment when multilateralism still carried a very strong post-war promise. Now, looking back, what did you learn about how international institutions really shape people's lives, often in an invisible manner? I know you also wrote a book about that. If you can mention it, it would be great. And what lessons from that period are still relevant today?
Well, when I started in the UN in the 1960s, which is a little while ago, and the UN at that point was in a final process of moving from the post-World War II to the real world. And what you began to see is that you began to build on an understanding of what the international system was supposed to do we didn't have before. Now, let me go back 100 years from my starting point, 1867, when the first international organization was created. It was called the International Telegraphic Union. And it was set up because somebody discovered you could create telegraphs and sent them. And all you had to have was an agreement. Well, there were some problems internationally with telegram. First of all, you had to have an agreement on what was in telegrams, on the Morse code, and then you had to have an agreement on a little bit of the science of how you were able to send the things electronically. But the most important issue was finance, because if you wanted to send a telegram, you would pay a company to send your telegram, and then it would go someplace. And if it went to another country, it would be delivered. But how do you pay the country that delivered it? And the answer was, we'll set up an international system that allows the system to work so that both the senders and receivers would get income. And that was the creation of the International Telegraphic Union, which now is called the International Telecommunications Union, because we've added some more telecommunications. It's located in Geneva, Switzerland. So that was one. And the second one that also happened about the same time was a thing that became the International Committee for the Red Cross. And that was because a person went down and observed a war and said, we're doing terrible things to civilians and to soldiers who are wounded. We have to figure out how to make this work better. And they set up this institution to change the names of the rules of war. And that eventually happened. Now, let's go forward 100 years. And what's happened is that an increasing number of issues need international agreements in order to solve the transborder issues. Now, I talked about transborder issues like climate change, but there are other transborder issues like crime, for example, that have to be dealt with. And as it has evolved, an increasing number of issues are being addressed by an international system based on agreed rules with institutions that do things. The one I mentioned is the internet. Now, the internet is totally new. It's not like the telegraph and stuff like that. Internet actually was started being developed in the 1990s, early, because it's a new thing, and they had to deal with some issues. For example, they had to figure out how to give everybody an address that worked, because what we're doing with this is we're sending from my address to your address. You had to have a way of assigning addresses, because otherwise the internet stuff wouldn't know where to go. And that was set up, strangely enough, as a international fund. But more and more issues of the internet, such as crime and things like that, developed. So you had to begin to develop an international system, and that's still happening. But you do have, at the heart of things, an international secretariats dealing with these. And that is what I put in my book about it, called Internet Governance, which was following another book I did about what is happening overall about all kinds of issues, which I called International Governance. And that's based on a system where at the heart there are international people, both in governments and in international organizations and in non-governmental organizations, who work together under being seen to make things happen. And that's what we do. And that's what has happened. And in the 5 areas that I mentioned, there are now institutions, agreements. Most of them don't go far enough. The one on the internet doesn't go far enough because it hasn't got an agreement on how to deal with AI, for example. But, for example, the one on nuclear, we have a good system that works. It's being applied. It's going to be applied again in what's happening in the Middle East, in Iran, for example, where my friends, when I worked in the IAEA, will provide the kind of accountability that is necessary to make something work. And there are other issues like that.
So you were making reference now to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, Austria, right? The
Yes.
UN one, right? Today, the world is more fragmented, impatient, and polarized. From your perspective, John, what is the most important role the UN can still play, not in theory, but in practice, in protecting fairness, inclusion, and cooperation across regions, including Europe?
Well, the way to do that is the international system can reach the necessary agreement on norms and rules, on a rules-based society. And the way in which you make sure that the rules follow is by being able to identify who is doing it well and applaud, and who is not doing it well and suggest that they should fix it some. That's how the system works. And I know that particularly in the area of gender, because that was where I worked. And we, in the Beijing conference in 1995, we reached an agreement on where you ought to go. And this was agreed by all states. That's in what was called the Platform for Action. One of the things people don't know why it's called a Platform for Action is that the states and us as a secretariat said, we should call it something politically that you run on, which is what a platform does. And this is what we should be running on in the future. And in fact, we haven't achieved everything, but we've achieved a lot. And we've been able to build gender into other issues. For example, one of the issues of climate change has been you have to have leaders who understand that you have to deal with the future as well as the present. And one of the things we discovered is the difference between male leaders and female leaders is that female leaders tended to be more interested in the future, or male leaders are only about the present. And so if we have more female leaders, we are likely to have better solution. And if we look at the data since 1995 to now, there are more female leaders, including, for example, one who was the head of the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and today is the head of the World Meteorological Organization. Gender, women's equality, onward.
And who knows, even maybe the next UN Secretary General could be a woman, right?
Yes.
So let's see what happens. If you were 20 years old in 2071, and I know that your spirit is so young that you're able to vision yourself there, projected in 2071, what kind of global system would you hope to inherit? And then I have a second part of the question.
All right. The global system that I would hope to inherit is the one that is beginning to evolve. It's one where you reach international agreements and set up institutions to solve global problems. And that when I was there, I would say, hey, I see this system and I want to be part of it. And you would get more and more young people saying, hey, how do I join it? And then you would find out that the internet, the education systems and the training systems were set up to deal with that improved system that's sitting out there. And if it's in 2070, gosh, we obviously must have solved some of the problems like climate change, because the tipping point was 2050.
Yep. What should today's institutions, John, universities, governments, and private companies do now to build a future where cooperation, equity, and also human dignity are not optional values, but are part of how decisions are made?
It's the institutions that train people should build an understanding of how the system does and should work successfully. And the institutions at the level of government, at the level of corporations and intergovernmental organizations should actually understand the kind of values that their staffs and leaders should have to deal with these problems using this excellent system that we are creating.
So, if you could leave one message to young leaders entering public service, international organizations, or global business today, what would you tell them not to forget, John?
Don't forget that collective work, consensus, conflict-free decision-making, and a view towards the future is how you should prepare yourself and apply yourself when you get the jobs.
And we have seen that it works. I mean, during past conversations you and I had, I remember you mentioning the power of working together collectively. So united, we can win.
Yes, exactly.
John, I thank you so much for this thoughtful and timely conversation. What I take from our exchange is that multilateralism is more than diplomacy. It's a leadership test, and the UN reminds us that global cooperation must be built, renewed, and made credible through decisions that respect dignity, inclusion, real human needs, and finding a common denominator on which we can work together. Inclusive leadership is my baby presently, so it is not only about who sits at the table, I would say. So inviting young generations to sit at the table, it's fine, but we also need to give them the keys to enter into those rooms and not just sitting at the table. And it is about how decisions are made, whose voices are heard, and whether institutions can turn values into systems that work better for people. And this goes beyond the UN, for Europe, governments, universities, organizations that really want to remain trusted, relevant, and socially sustainable. So thank you so much, Dr. John Mathiason, for helping us look at the invisible machinery of global cooperation in these challenging geopolitical times, and for reminding us leadership still needs purpose, courage, and hope. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you to my guests and to all of you for listening. New episodes are released on the first and the third Saturday of every month. Music by Damian Morton. Social media production by Create More Studio. I'm Daniela Bas, and this conversation continues.